Well,
Evening all. Very warm welcome to the Frontline Club. This evening we are super lucky to have Antony Loewenstein here, who's flown in from Jerusalem this week to talk about the war on drugs and specifically his own book on that subject. And Gabriel Gatehouse, Newsnight International Editor. He's very kindly joined us to chair and join in this discussion. Huge thanks to both of you. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating book. I've just read through it, almost all of it, at high speed. And I think it's a subject that obviously of huge interest to a lot of people. Before we get into what's in the book, Antony, can you just give us a brief description of what led you to start this investigation?
So I've been a journalist since early 2000, so just after 9/11, and a lot of the work that I've done around the world touched on issues in some ways connected to that event. Palestine, the war in Afghanistan, various issues like that. And I think about 5 years ago, I started thinking to myself, there was one issue which I hadn't really examined for no particular reason, which was the drug war. And since 9/11, what many in the US who support it have done is connected it to the war on terror. Essentially saying that terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, now ISIS and others, are being funded through drugs, so the argument goes, and therefore we have to increase funding to fight the drug war and the terror war. I think there's a lot of dubious claims in that, which I discuss in the book. But so about 5 years ago, I thought I'd investigate what the drug war meant, and also for two reasons. One, I felt that for a lot of people, as the US, many states were legalizing pot, the sense that the drug war was winding down, or that it was inevitably going to end because America will legalize marijuana, Uruguay then it legalized marijuana, now Canada has, and other states will follow, including possibly here in the UK. And also the sense that for a lot of people, I think they believe that Mexico, the violence there is apocalyptic and it's only getting worse. But it's very targeted there, rather than actually understanding that the drug war, in fact, has never been more bloody and more violent. And that's largely, although not solely, because the demand for drugs has never been higher. This is across the world, including here in the UK, and the drugs have to come from somewhere. And they're usually coming from places that require a lot of hard work and ugliness and violence and desperation, and I wanted to go to the sources of those, some of the places where that was actually being done.
So this is a very wide-ranging, geographically wide-ranging book. I mean,
yes.
You go from Honduras to Guinea-Bissau to the Philippines, as well as the United States, Britain, and Australia, as befits a global trade and a global problem. Why did you pick the particular countries that you went for? And let's start with, if you like, the countries that you chose divide, if you like, into those that are either producing or transit countries for the trade, and those that are predominantly the users of it.
Well, Honduras and Guinea-Bissau are the first two countries I went to, and I guess I partly wanted to go there because not enough journalists, in my view, do. Honduras, for those who don't know, most of the cocaine going into the US goes via Honduras. Guinea-Bissau, a tiny country in West Africa, a lot of the cocaine going into Europe and the UK from South America goes via Guinea-Bissau. And that was enough reason to go on its own.
But you very deliberately didn't go to
Mexico or Colombia
or Afghanistan or any of the obvious places.
Yes, and it wasn't, as I try to say in the book, because those places aren't important. Clearly they are. I guess I felt, particularly Colombia and Mexico, they'd been more reported, and sometimes well, sometimes not. Afghanistan clearly is an important country. It's where most of the world's heroin comes from, and Myanmar is second. And again, I guess you have to make choices, and I try to explain, hopefully for good reasons, why I chose the places that I did. And I think also, and of course I didn't predict this when I started writing the book, that Honduras has become far more in the news since the Trump administration. So many of the refugees trying to come into the US in the last 3 years have tried to come from Honduras. And what has frustrated me since is how few people have asked the obvious question, what is actually causing so much carnage in Honduras? It is one of the most violent countries on the planet. The rate of sexual assaults, violence, domestic abuse is off the chart. Abortion is completely illegal. The rate of gang violence is massive. And as I said, a lot of the cocaine, in fact, most of the cocaine going into the US goes via Honduras from usually other countries, Colombia, etc. And I went there and found a country that's completely broken. It's a narco-state. It's run by a US-backed president who, and again, one of the things I tried to articulate in the book is, since the book has now come out during the Trump administration, Trump is not the problem here. Trump is terrible on this issue. Trump has empowered, supported, funded some of these thugs. But these problems existed long before him. And Obama, in fact, sorry, briefly, in terms of Honduras, it was Obama as the administration who supported the coup in 2009 that's caused some of these problems.
So I think the chapter on Honduras was very interesting in terms of unpicking the relationship between the United States, which is the sort of global leader, if you like, in the war on drugs, quote unquote, and the countries and or producers who are making the drugs. And then you get this picture of this country, Honduras, sort of caught in the middle between these two forces. And you write a lot about the actions of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And the picture that you get is of a sort of self-perpetuating cycle whereby the US is trying to stamp out this trade, but in fact is enabling it.
Yes.
Can you just unpick that a little bit for us, specifically from what you found in Honduras?
The rhetoric of the drug war has always been, from the US and its proponents, including here in the UK, that the idea of the drug war is to end drug use or at least reduce it, reduce drug trafficking to make it a manageable, so to speak, issue. When in fact, much of the drug war's policies for now 40 odd years, if not more, has in fact worsened the problem. On every kind of metric, drug use and abuse, drug trafficking, drug violence is worse. There's been ups and downs in various countries over the years, to be sure, but in general, because demand now is so high, because many of these drugs remain illegal, because prohibition creates a market where criminal gangs will operate and thrive, and Honduras is a classic example of that, where you have a situation where in the last years you have a president whose brother recently, Tony Hernandez, was found guilty in a US court for trying to import cocaine into the US. The leader of Honduras...
Right, and this is a country that has a US-backed president.
Has a US-backed president,
so
has a
there's an obvious
US-funded...
contradiction.
There are a lot of contradictions here, absolutely. And you find that this is not really a secret. In other words, it's not like the US would be shocked that Honduras is a massive narco-state. They know it. That's in fact why they support it. They support it.
That sounds very counterintuitive. Explain that.
I think in general, and this is more a question, I guess, about empire, which we might not have time to go into, but in general, the US democracy is not helpful for an empire. They actually want a compliant state, a state that they can manage. A democracy is unpredictable. You can't control necessarily what a country or leadership does. With the client state, of which the world has many, Honduras being one, they can roughly speaking control what's happening there. And since Trump came into power, one of the key things that has happened there is maybe he doesn't have a clue what's going on, people around him certainly do, that Honduras is a key country to try to assist America, so America says, in trying to stop people fleeing Honduras in the first place, to try to curtail the so-called migrant crisis. Not doing a very good job of it, I might add, because the threat there is so great that people will flee, regardless of what you do. So America is pumping huge amounts of money into Honduras and its armed forces and its police, many of whom commit horrible, horrible abuses. The US doesn't care about that. What they care is that they hope that the US will stop people fleeing to come into the US. And they're not being very successful at that. And that's the same in Guatemala and other places like that, to the point now where Trump is talking about forcibly sending people back to Honduras, which has been happening. People often are being killed when they get sent back. So the reality of the narco state there is, and I spend time in some of the remote areas where these narco gangs operate, that there's an illusion of fighting a drug war. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, fights a war. And I spoke to in the book current DEA members, former DEA members, the former head of the DEA in Honduras, who still speaks very positively about what a glorious job he did, and suffice to say I disagree with that. But nonetheless, he argues that we as a DEA fought drugs there and did our best in a very hard situation. But on any metric, again, which is the only way you can judge it, The amount of cocaine going through Honduras is massive. The amount of cocaine being used in America by countless people is off the chart. It's huge.
The question I have about specifically Honduras is it's not clear to me whether the war on drugs as it is pursued in Honduras by the United States is simply unsuccessful due to bad strategy, or at some points in the book there are definite suggestions that actually the war on drugs is for some people in the United States a desirable state of affairs that is deliberately being self-perpetuated. Where do you come down on that, and what's your evidence?
My last book was called Disaster Capitalism. Although I don't talk much about that in this book, that clearly is a key part of this. There are a lot of people making a lot of money from the drug war staying as it is or increasing. And the very clever things that the Pentagon and the DEA has done since 9/11, as I said, is tying the drug war to the terror war. So their budgets have ballooned hugely. This is under both Democrat and Republican presidents, to say that unless we fight those two wars together, unless we go after Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups and their alleged drug syndicates, the terror war will never end, and therefore the drug war can never end. And I guess what I try to say in the book is this is actually a complicated picture. On the one hand, the drug war is undeniably violent and brutal and ugly. On the other hand, it's also a game. It's a game that its major purveyors know they will never win. That's the point. The point is that it's aimed to fail, except rhetorically and practically it has a lot of impact on people around the world who have no voice. So-called unpeople, people who have no voice and no influence, really. It's usually, and as I say, the war on drugs is always about a war on the poor. The rich people in London, for example, are not mostly being arrested or charged for doing coke, nor do I think they should be. But the people who are being affected in the UK and elsewhere in Honduras...
Get onto that.
Yes. I don't think anyone should be arrested for using drugs, but that's a separate issue. But we can discuss that. But ultimately, I think the drug war targets people who have no real ability to fight back.
So, sticking with Honduras for a bit, and then we'll move on to some of the other places. You talked to a woman, Clara, whose a family member had been killed in a botched drug enforcement agency operation in 2012. And you said, I'm just going to read a little bit from your book. You said, I feared that she was being re-victimized by my interviewing her, and I didn't feel entirely comfortable doing it. Spending time with Clara challenged my ability to be a neutral journalist, simply reporting what she said. Objectivity felt inappropriate in the face of such suffering. Her story was horrific, and she deserved justice. And then you say, I didn't believe that featuring her testimony would radically change her situation. So it's such a bleak picture here, because as a journalist, one always hopes that what one does can at least bring bad things to light and thereby change it. But you seem to be saying that actually there is nothing you can do to help powerless people like this who are affected by the war on drugs.
I felt often in this book, and a lot of my reporting over the years, that I think too often journalists see themselves as the hero, and it's often complete bullshit. I'm not saying there aren't journalists who are...
Always complete bullshit.
It's mostly bullshit. Of course there are journalists who do heroic things and write amazingly insightful stories that have impact. That's undeniable, here and elsewhere. I don't deny that for a second. But the idea that when you speak to someone like this who is invisible in almost any sense of the word. I spoke to the person I was with, my fixer in Honduras, and we discussed this with her, about her situation and others, about the impact of me speaking to her would have on her. And he convinced me, he was a sensitive person who I think understood the situation well, that it was important that more people knew her story, rather than saying that by getting the story out, she would find justice. Almost certainly she will not find justice. Just in case you don't know, very briefly, this woman was involved in a botched DEA raid in 2012. There were 4 people who were killed. There was in a very remote part of Honduras, there was a boat that was probably full of cocaine. It's not entirely clear. And the DEA suddenly appeared out of nowhere, started shooting wildly from planes and from boats. 4 people were killed, including her son. And she was devastated, as of course you would be. She's received no compensation, not really any compensation from the US or Honduras. Neither side accepts responsibility. And she is but one of many victims of a drug war. And you ask yourself, when you write about this and when you see it, what exactly is the purpose of this? I mean,
what conclusion did you come?
Well, in her particular case, in cases like that, I guess I came to the conclusion, as I often have with stories like this, that I do convince myself, rightly or wrongly, that it's important to tell the story as long as that person's not profoundly traumatized by doing so. As much as you can tell, clearly I left her. I didn't stay with her for months and years on end. I'm in touch with my fixer in Honduras regularly, who does have contact with her. It's one of the things I've always thought is important as a journalist, is that to maintain as much as possible contact with people in the countries in which you work. I'm not living in Honduras, but to maintain a relationship with people there, I give them credit when it's due, because I think too often journalists do not do that, still, in this day and age, and they should. Too often, as I said, we see ourselves as a hero and don't actually mention the fact that, by the way, this would never have happened unless I had the help of person X or person Y. But in this sort of story, it makes me angry, and I felt that telling the story would give a really human face of the, not just the futility of the drug war, which it clearly is, but the sense that it doesn't have to be like this. Although I'm very pessimistic about those who support the drug war and will want it to continue, and there are huge players who do want it to continue because they're either making money from it ideologically, they support the idea that we can't as a society support people taking cocaine. So the argument goes, we can't have a society where people are going around saying using heroin's fine. We can't do that, can we? So the argument goes. And I don't think we should go around saying that either, but the current situation that exists in most countries, it's not just failed, it's actually inhumane. That the rate of harm and death and dislocation because of drugs, illegal drugs, illicit substances, is so major, including in the UK, where the rates of abuse and use has never been higher in the last 5 or 10 years, that I feel it's my duty or responsibility, I'm not a British person, of course, but as a human being, to say this is bullshit.
Let's move on to Guinea-Bissau, because you called Honduras a narco-state, by which I think you mean that the levers of power have been basically taken over by drug dealers.
Yes.
And you're careful not to apply that label to Guinea-Bissau.
I question it there. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist there.
So just tell us a little bit about what role Guinea-Bissau plays in this trade and what position it occupies.
So Guinea-Bissau is this tiny, tiny country in West Africa that virtually no one's heard of. It has a tiny population, a former Portuguese colony, independent in 1974, does not have a level of violence of Honduras, to be sure. It's not like Mexico. You sort of go there and it's very poor. It's a major exporter cashews. It seems like it looks like what would be like a poor, beautiful beaches, but a poor country where people have little opportunity. What's happened in the last 15 or so years, South American drug cartels have found a willing and weak state to turn it into a key transit country for cocaine. So much of the cocaine coming from Colombia and Peru, particularly Colombia, is going through Guinea-Bissau.
So just to be clear, it goes from South America.
Mostly by boat, sometimes by plane.
Crosses the Atlantic.
Indeed.
And then a lot of it crosses the Atlantic back again to go to the United States.
No, so the coke that's going through Guinea-Bissau is predominantly targeted for Europe and the UK. So Honduras, particularly in places like that in Central America, are where cocaine is going through to go to the US. West Africa is particularly a transit area for Europe and the UK. It arrives in Guinea-Bissau, massive, huge amounts of cocaine, often in bricks. Last year, for example, there was the largest confiscation of cocaine. It was more than a ton, worth huge amounts of money. Of course, realising that when they catch a lot of cocaine, a lot of it is getting through, inevitably, as we see the huge amounts of coke arriving in Europe and the UK. And it then goes from Guinea-Bissau up through parts of Africa, often through militant groups that are involved in the process. It then gets into Europe, and then various other groups, particularly Albanian groups and others, are distributing the drugs to Europe, to the UK and elsewhere.
There was a detail in that, actually, in the book that I found fascinating and I thought might have been worthy of a documentary or a book on its own. And you described these so-called humanitarian caravans from
crazy.
Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, etc., that bring second-hand clothes
And ambulances.
down to West Africa and then return
With drugs.
Can you just talk to me about that? Because that...
It's weird. It is weird. Well, I didn't meet any of these humanitarians, just to be clear, but
someone should do that documentary.
Yes, I mean, it's a great... I mean, I can't imagine they're going to be that keen to have a camera crew with them, of course, but, you know, you never know. If they're innovative, maybe yes. Look, basically there are people particularly from Eastern Europe, who are convinced that they can, as a cover story, as I said, take down often necessary goods, clothes, second-hand ambulances, to parts of West Africa, not just Guinea-Bissau, but other places as well. And then they make their way back. Overland principally. Yeah, obviously there's sea at some point they need to cross by boat,
Sure.
of course, but it's principally overland. And when they return from Guinea-Bissau and other countries in West Africa, and a lot of other places around there, such as Ivory Coast, Guinea-Conakry, are also key transit countries for cocaine, they then take huge amounts of cocaine back. Now, that's not the sole or primary way that coke is getting to Europe. It's not. But it's a weird detail that I heard when I was there, and many people talked to me about it, and some of them, local people in Guinea-Bissau, had met some of these so-called humanitarian coke transporters, I guess you'd call them. I would love to meet them. If they're out there, please contact me. I will.
Anyone in this room, you can find them afterwards.
Anonymity assured. And, I mean, I guess I haven't got much more to say apart from that. I mean, there's more detail in the book. People can read it, and they should. But it's a really strange thing. And I guess what it shows in some ways, and I'll finish on this point, is that it really shows the complete impunity of the process. In other words, there's so little of these drugs being captured by authorities that the traffickers are so confident that people like this can actually, in all likelihood, get the drugs back through a variety of countries from West Africa to Europe. And that shows that, yes, law enforcement exists, and yes, now and then they make big busts. To me, that is a height of futility.
So just on the big busts, because you write about this big bust in 2013, that then ended up in a court in Manhattan, and it was trumpeted as this big success in the war on drugs, that then turned out basically to be a piece of theatre. Just tell us a little bit about that.
So the former head of the Guinea-Bissau Navy, I'll give a very brief summary, was accused by the US of being one of West Africa's key drug kingpins. And he was essentially set up in a way that what I talk about in the book in detail, which a lot of people maybe are not aware. The DEA and also the FBI, particularly since 9/11, regularly create it's constant. It's entrapment. In other words, they create a massive. And so again, this is not me making this up. This has been documented by this case and many others, where people are convinced to be involved in incredibly complicated either terror plots, but actually aren't interested necessarily in committing it, or drug trafficking. This guy had been involved in being convinced that he should potentially traffic cocaine. He never actually did traffic any cocaine. He may, again, not saying this guy was clean, he may not have been. He was captured off the Guinea-Bissau coast by the US in 2013, taken back to the US, and put on in a weird trial that was a bit of a sham, mostly held behind closed doors. Found guilty, he actually pled guilty, and was given 4 years. This is a major kingpin given 4 years. He's now back in Guinea-Bissau.
He walked free like a month later or something, didn't he?
Well, after the 4 years he did in jail, he suffered in there. I didn't speak to him, but I spoke to a lot of the key players who were involved in this process. I did a bit of a deep dive in the story because it seemed to be a really good case study of how and why the US will trumpet successes in the war on terror and the war on drugs, because they're often connected in the way that they're advertised by the US. So often the media around this particular guy's story, in the mainstream press and by the US government, will say, we've taken down a massive kingpin.
We've disrupted a plot to bring in lots of...
Yes, into the US.
But the key, the twist being that this plot would never have existed.
Without the DEA making it up.
Right, yeah.
And there are countless people in the US now, since 9/11, who are in jail. Again, this is not the DEA, this is also the FBI, particularly Muslims, who have been entrapped in alleged terror plots, who are in jail for the rest of their life for plots they never actually committed. Now, that to me is profoundly unjust and very problematic when nothing has been committed and you are often, I would say, how do I put this in a polite way? Convincing often people who have not only, but often mental health problems to allegedly commit, or to be convinced that committing certain crimes will fulfill their aim. And I'm not saying for a second, just to be clear, that there aren't people who in the US and elsewhere want to commit terrorist acts. Clearly there are. We saw that in London this week. I get that. But the idea that you have in the US since 9/11, the FBI entraps countless people, and the DEA has done likewise. I have a stat in there which the DEA, there are, no one knows the exact number, but there are probably around 20,000 DEA informants, many of whom used to be involved in some kind of plots that are now on the DEA payroll, convincing weak-willed, silly, unfortunate people to allegedly get involved in drug plots. Now, you have to ask yourself, when it goes to trial, if it ever does, are we going to actually believe someone who is on the DEA payroll to say this person's a bad person and put them away? And in the case of this guy, the former Navy chief of Guinea-Bissau, he was given 4 years. And again, you ask yourself, right, so he's such a serious kingpin, he's given 4 years. And I'm not saying he should have got 50 years. I'm just saying that it makes you question the whole rationale of what the DEA does and how they go about doing it. And also, frankly, the right. What right does the DEA have to essentially go into the waters of Guinea-Bissau, nab someone, it's like extraordinary rendition of sorts, and bring them back to the US and then judge them in a court to be guilty?
The thing that struck me about that story was that there was obviously this element of theatre about it. It almost seemed more aimed at a sort of a domestic American audience,
yes,
perhaps to secure funding, continued funding, yes, of this organisation, rather than disrupting the global,
yes,
trade in drugs.
And sorry, one point on that, and just to be very clear, the amount of drugs that are going through West Africa have not gone down. So the idea somehow that bust will have massively affected the amount of cocaine, it does not, it has not, it will not, it won't, regardless of what is done, barring unbelievably more aggressive militaristic solutions, so to speak, which I guess is not impossible, which the US likely will not do, because the demand for the drug is there. I mean, this is the point. The demand for the drug, demand meaning here and in the US and in Europe, the demand, particularly for cocaine and other drugs, has never been higher. So,
right, and so that's actually the other half of your book, basically. We haven't touched on the Philippines yet, and maybe we'll come back to that in a second, but this seems like a good point to look at the flip side of this trade. The US, the UK, and Australia. You went to all three places, and what most struck you in your investigations on say, the consumer end of the stick?
I guess what didn't surprise me was a lot of people want to take drugs. More and more people like taking drugs, and I don't say that in a judgmental way. I think people should have the right to take drugs that are safe and regulated.
One reviewer criticised you for apparently not being keen enough on drugs, or at least not not talking about it enough.
Yes, that was Will Self. Thank you, Will Self. Yes, there were some comments about that, which people can read it online. I disagree with that analysis, for the record, but thank you for that.
People can come up to you afterwards and ask for details. But
indeed, but I suppose what shocked me in a way was the fact that there is still this unbelievably ugly demonization of drug users. And this is all
certain types of drug users.
Certain types and certain classes. And that's partly what I wanted to talk about in the book, was that a lot of the drug war is about class. It's about the fact that the majority of people who are using certain kinds of drugs are not being arrested or harassed or prosecuted in London or elsewhere. Nor do I think they should be, to be clear. But the people who are, a lot, are those who are poor, underprivileged. Could be white or black. And in the US, I guess what moved me was spending time with some of during the Obama administration, his first term was kind of a lost cause on fighting the drug war. In the second term, he at least made some attempts to pull back some of the damaging domestic drug war policies, particularly against people of colour, particularly African Americans. And he put out a call that lawyers should put forward their clients who deserve essentially to be released and freed. And tens of thousands of lawyers put their clients forward. He released around 1,700, give or take. And I met two of those men, African American men, who were going to die in prison had they not been released by Obama. These people were low-level, they had committed crimes, they undeniably had, they were dealing drugs. I think one had been entrapped, but nonetheless, they had. And I guess what was so moving about that was, and I'm quite critical of Obama in the book, and I think one should be critical of Obama on most things personally, but there's no doubt that he gave these two men a second lease on life. And what is so devastating is that there are still so many people in the US who are there for non-violent drug offences. And one of the things that did shock me was that after so many states have legalised cannabis, in 2018 FBI figures show that the arrest rate and prosecution rate for cannabis remains insanely high.
But you've also got a situation now where the direction of travel in the US in terms of legislation is towards legalizing cannabis. Some states, you can sell cannabis on a large or small scale, while at the same time you have guys in jail for the rest of their lives for selling a small bag of weed. I mean, that's
insane. And not surprisingly, there are a lot of people who are pushing legalization for cannabis, and I support that view as well, who say, we don't want a situation here where only the people who can make money from it are the rich people, white or black. In many states in the US, or the clever states at least, have tried to put some kind of policies in place that give either greater access or I guess what I would call a form of reparation in a way. I mean, to me, there needs to be, as a key part of winding back the drug war, reparations. Reparations can be financial, or maybe more importantly, allowing people who have suffered the most from the drug war to have access to it if they choose to. When I say access to it, meaning if they want to be involved in the cannabis business. If they don't want to, of course, that's fine. But often, the legal cannabis business, and there are a lot of people in parts of the US who can't get access to that because they have criminal convictions, often to do with drugs. So I spent time with people who said, we don't want a corporatized cannabis culture, or for that matter here, any country that does it. And I worry that if the UK or any Western country decides to go down the path of legalizing cannabis, which I believe it should, that the likely, and I think this is a fear of if and when the Tories are still in power or Boris Johnson remains Prime Minister here, I know he just won re-election, but if he stays in power for a couple of years or 5 years or more, that the people who are most excited about this and the likely to benefit first, I fear, are the big cannabis producers rather than those who have suffered the most from British unjust drug laws. That is not the right way to do it. Almost like the Marlborization of drugs, of a legal drug market. And one final thing on this point was that clearly the legalization of cannabis, while it's had a huge impact on reducing, with all its problems, people being arrested for relatively minor drug offences, although that's still happening far too much, is the fact that so much of the drug war is still focused on other drugs. It's not really just about cannabis, it's about cocaine, heroin. And also the opioid crisis in America has changed that conversation too.
I was going to ask you about that because you seem to have come out of this book
angry,
but also quite strongly of the opinion that legalizing drugs is a good thing.
Yes.
Now, the opioid crisis is a crisis of legal drugs. So clearly, legalizing drugs doesn't prevent their abuse and misuse, and doesn't prevent a lot of people suffering from them being around. So what did you find that allows you to square that circle?
There's no doubt that legal drugs, an opioid, for example, can clearly cause massive harm. I mean, I don't go into great depth about the opioid crisis in the US, but clearly there are a lot of people who are complicit in that. So-called, doctors and others who overprescribed, drug companies that were, I think...
Pharmaceutical companies that are now being sued, yeah.
Indeed, they are being sued, but they're also looking now for foreign markets when the US legislation is going to crack down on them, which may happen. So a lot of these companies now are looking for new markets, such as Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, where the death rate for opioids, in fact, is soaring because there's sadly a lot of other foreign governments aren't as savvy enough to crack down on these companies as much as they should. But the issue, I think, of someone like me who advocates legalising drugs and regulating them is not to say that removes everyone's problem with drugs. That somehow if you legalise and regulate drugs, therefore no one's going to have problems with drugs. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that you mitigate harm and you acknowledge the fact of two things. One, that in a mature society, people should have the right to be able to use drugs safely, which means a few things in my view. In a legalised system, you would not advertise, no advertising at all. Zero advertising. There should be warning labels on various drugs. You would not simply go into a Boots and buy cocaine. No one's arguing that. I don't argue that. There are different levels of seriousness of drugs where they're available. Could be at a pharmacy, it could be at a doctor, whatever it may be. It depends on the seriousness and the strength of the drug. So much of the problem that's happening in the US in the last few years, just to be clear about opioids, is people, in fact, are not generally as much dying from the opioid. They're dying from fentanyl now, which is a different situation. And many of the cartels in Mexico that are involved in a crazy drug war with the US and Mexican forces are now producing fentanyl for the US market because they see a demand for that, and you see that other places around the world. But the reason I can square that is that you take out the fact that the drug industry, illegal drug industry, is worth around $500 billion a year. That is going principally to people who you don't want to be giving money to, criminal gangs, and other groups. And to me, there are a number of people who have done amazing work articulating what a legalised drug market would look like. And there are people in the UK, the US and elsewhere. There's a man in this room called Danny Kushlik who's done amazing work on the drug war in the last 20 years, articulating what a legalised market would look like, and many others. And it's not done, I don't want to speak for him, I'm speaking for myself, but it's not done because there's a belief somehow that you totally minimise or reduce drug harm. You acknowledge the fact that the current prohibition mindset is so damaging and so harmful, ethically, morally and practically, that a legalised system says that drugs would be regulated. In other words, you know what's in what you're getting. It's not encouraging people to take drugs. My view is there should be drug education from a very young age. Maybe not kindergarten, but young, a mature drug education. Portugal is the best example of this. Portugal, in 2001, decriminalised all drugs. All drugs. And they were facing the worst HIV rates in Europe. Drug use and abuse has dived. Portugal still has problems with drugs. Of course it does. And Portugal is not the rest of the world, but Portugal is the best, with all its faults, and there are some, the best example of a country that not just treats its citizens with maturity and says you have the right to take drugs if you so choose. We don't encourage you to do so. The money that would be spent on law enforcement now, which is an insane amount of the average UK budget, US budget, towards law enforcement, goes towards principally education and health. That's the shift. It's also a shift of mindset of saying, what exactly is the point of keeping drugs illegal? Are we saying that as a society we're hoping that less people will take drugs? Are we hoping that kids of today, kids of tomorrow, won't be taking as many drugs? If that's the argument, it's not just failed, but it's failed like spectacularly. And there's no way to get around that, right? I mean, drug use and abuse in the UK just finally, which maybe we can get to, is, on certain drugs at least, is devastating at the moment. And the idea that we are still talking around the edge, not us here, but as in British media in general and society, talking around the edges about how we deal with this is insane. I mean, England hasn't even got a safe consumption room for in intravenous drugs. I mean, it's just...
And the problem is politics, not medical advice.
It is, and a lot of politicians you speak to, including some who are in my book, this is Labour and the Conservatives, the ones who know what they're talking about, will say, sometimes, mostly off the record, we know this is bullshit. It's not working. So the question is, how does that change? And I think the media has a lot of culpability in that.
I was going to say, I mean, the reason why...
Not you personally.
The reason why no British leader or American leader will say, hey, let's legalize all drugs.
Bernie Sanders is. Well, he's not saying that. He's saying legalize cannabis, yes.
Let's see if he gets elected.
True.
Is that, the press will make mincemeat of them and they'll never
But there's a shift, you're right. You're right, Gabriel, but there's actually been a shift in the last 5 years, and I explain this in the book. The devastating effects of the drug war is real. There's no way to get around that, and it's arguably getting worse. But there actually has been a shift, and this is not me being, because I'm not prone to be optimistic in general when it comes to issues, but on this issue there is actually some signs of optimism. A few things briefly. One, in this US election cycle, not all, but most of the Democratic candidates are talking seriously about some kind of drug reform. Now, they might not win. We don't know. But there's everyone from the Bernie Sanders view, which is I'm going to legalise cannabis through executive order, to reparations for the drug war. He's not advocating all drugs should be legalised, true. Tulsi Gabbard, who won't win, yes, but she advocates legalising, regulating all drugs. There are many other candidates who are talking, Elizabeth Warren, serious candidates, who could well make changes domestically at least to the drug war. Another, I think, almost gateway drug, so to speak, on this issue is the growing use medically of psychedelics, LSD, mushrooms, ecstasy, for mental health issues, PTSD issues, end-of-life concerns, people who are trying to stop smoking. The scientific evidence for this is actually overwhelming. There's still a lot more to be done, but the idea that within a few years in the US, the heart of the drug war, the FDA is talking by 2022, roughly, to potentially legally allow therapists to be able to prescribe psychedelic drugs to people, not to take home, of course, but to in controlled environments to use these drugs to treat trauma and mental health problems. That, to me, will make a lot of drugs seem far more normal, so to speak. And that encourages me because much of the world is going through a major mental health crisis. This is not saying everyone should be taking ecstasy, not at all, but it says that a lot of people, maybe they should actually, that could help people's mood. But I do think that when you find a mental health crisis in the world, a loneliness crisis in the world, that if drugs that have been demonized for so long can be treated in controlled environments in a mature way and they're regulated and legalized, then I think, and it's again not my opinion, scientific studies show this, it actually could make profound impacts on people's lives in a positive way. So
before I throw open some questions, I want to just bring it back a little bit to the reportage element of your book, which, as I said, it spans a wide geographic area, and we haven't talked about the Philippines yet, which in 2016, was it, when Duterte was elected, just exploded in this kind of orgy of anti-drugs violence. It had its own war on drugs that was so kind of eye-poppingly violent that no one could really believe it. And then that sort of disappeared off the agenda, as it were. When were you there, and what state did you find that country in that respect?
I was there a few years ago, and he was elected in mid-2016. No one knows how many people have been killed, but
we're talking tens of thousands.
We're talking potentially at least 30,000 killed. The vast, vast majority are poor people. A lot of people in those communities take something called shabu, which is like methamphetamine. It's a very cheap kind of drug. And the Philippines part of the reporting was disturbing because a lot of people in the country support him. A lot of people who are affected by the drug war support him. Of course, there are people who don't, to be clear. But the support that he has in that country is sort of undeniable. There was a midterm election recently. His party did much better than they had a few years before that. And I guess the disturbing part was the Philippines is almost doing the most grim human experiment now possible, where the senior drug officials who appear in my book say that their goal is to make Philippines drug-free by the end of Duterte's term. Illegal drug-free. Now, you and I hear that and say, yeah, good luck with that. But the effect of that is unleashing vigilante groups and police and mass violence on the poorest of the poor. they're not going after the high-level drug dealers or drug users in Manila. They're not being touched in general. And there's a lot of serious allegations that Duterte's family themselves are involved in drug trafficking, which is a nice touch to this whole situation. But what was disturbing there was seeing the communities that have been so affected, people who have had family members killed in front of them, that there is an example of what the Philippines is doing. There's almost sort of increasingly two models now where the world is going on drug policy, and the Philippines is part of that. For years and years and years, the US was sort of fighting a drug war and telling the world, you have to follow us or else. And that still to some extent exists, and Trump, of course, has ramped that up. But what has also happened in the last year is that countries that are even more hardline have sort of almost leapfrogged the US. I'm talking about, say, a country like Iran, China, Russia. Now they don't unleash as much carnage around the world because they're much smaller countries in terms of influence of drug policy, but the US is now seen as not as much of the leader, so to speak, in unleashing drug war violence. And the Philippines is clearly following a model that many, many people admire. It's increasingly a model that's being copied in parts of Asia. I'm talking about already there's been very brutal drug war violence in Indonesia and the Philippines and Bangladesh, but it's getting a lot worse. And the Philippines is seen as a model to follow because, again, like we see in a lot of other countries, there's impunity. Duterte is doing it. His police forces are getting away with it. I mean, there's talk about trying to take him to the ICC, which I would welcome. But that seems like a very far away point. And I guess being there, one of the things that was the most disturbing, I talk about this in the book, feeling like a real vulture, where there's sort of journalists and photographers there often who are following the drug war or call themselves night crawlers. They kind of sit in an office waiting to hear a call that someone's been shot dead, and they race out there and photograph it or write about it, which I think is a legitimate journalistic endeavour. But you feel kind of strange sitting there eating, your meal with these fellow local journalists waiting for a call one night. So we did it one night, nothing happened. Did it another night, get a call, and we race out to this area in a suburb of Manila, and we sort of see in the distance some lights. Get there, a man who ran a scrap metal shop had been shot dead, seemed to be by vigilantes who ran away as soon as he was shot. His body was still warm, not that I touched it, but you could tell that he'd just been shot. There was blood pouring out of his head. There was a crowd around him. There were kids with their phones taking photos. The police suddenly arrived and, took some photos and then took the body away and left. And I put that in there because, and afterwards I tried to chase up who this guy was and what happened to him and why was he shot and what happened. And I've folded up a number of times since I've been there. We'll never know. There's no serious police investigation into most of these cases because often the police are the ones who are involved. Or police-backed vigilantes are the ones who are involved. So there is a sense, I think, of trying to create utter societal fear about drug use and drug abuse. And one of the things that I found in the Philippines...
somebody talking about the Philippines talked about performative violence.
It is. Yeah. And one of the things that I found, and I really have a great deal of sympathy for people in the Philippines, or last year I was in Nigeria doing a film for Al Jazeera about tramadol, the opioid drug, is a lot of people who are taking these drugs, who are the poorest of the poor, it makes absolute sense that you would take drugs. Your life, literally people in, say, taking tramadol in Nigeria or taking shabu in the Philippines, the backbreaking work that they are doing, the amount of work that they are doing, the lives that they are living, is to get through the day you are taking these drugs. I'm not saying everybody, of course, but many people. And for me, as an outsider, a Westerner, a privileged person, to be judgmental about that, I thought was highly inappropriate, but also the idea that Duterte is doing, and people will I'm sure know this, Trump has praised him on many occasions. He's fighting the war that Trump wishes he could do in the US.
I think that's a moment to throw it open. There's somebody at the back there with glasses. Yes. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a question about, given what we know about the impact of drugs in terms of crime and environments, and whilst drugs are illegal, do you think people in the West who are educated and affluent, we're not involved in backbreaking labour, do you think it's people have a responsibility not to take drugs, because we know that by taking drugs we're just fueling the drug trade and everything that goes with it, and that actually it's kind of, we have a ethical responsibility not to do that.
Well, it's interesting you're asking that question, because in the last little while, since a book has come out here in the UK last month, there's been quite a lot of coverage about so-called woke coke. I mean, I'm not the first one to talk about this, but media stories that I didn't create, for the record, about this idea that there are woke people who want to be ethical and they are caring about what they eat and what they wear. So why wouldn't they want ethical drugs as well, ethically sourced drugs? And I've got no problem with that, and I'll get to that in a minute, but woke coke doesn't exist. There is no way to get ethically sourced, say, cocaine. It's not a thing. There are dealers who will say, either online, on the dark web, or on the street corner, for example, my cocaine is ethically sourced from, I know the farmer in Colombia. Well, yeah, maybe, but not likely. And the reason I say that is that I do talk about the idea that there is something and there should be something, and there's a growing movement around what ethically sourced drugs would actually mean. It means legalising and regulating them, but it means that there is undeniable harm, particularly with cocaine along the supply chain. I don't mean that I'm blaming people who use drugs. I'm not judgmental about that at all. But let's be real about the fact that if one consumes certain kinds of drugs, you are contributing to a supply chain which is ugly. There's no doubt about that, particularly cocaine. But the answer is not simply to be judgmental of those people and say, don't be judgmental, don't think like that. It's to say, what would an ethically sourced drug look like? What does that mean? And that means that everyone along the supply chain gets paid properly. They're unionised. They're given equal rights. They are actually treated with respect by various countries along the path. You would not have massive criminal networks making a fortune from this ugly trade. So, although the whole woke coke thing has been sort of funny in a way to get media coverage for the book, thank you, media, it is almost missing the point, which is that in a society, I think, like the UK and many other states that have, I actually can't think of any other issue where the law is more flagrantly ignored. The amount of drugs, and cocaine especially, which is consumed in this country is insane. It has never been higher. Last year, the police alleged, and that's only the stuff that they found, that it was the highest amount of Class A and cocaine drugs they'd ever found since records began in 1973. The cost of cocaine's died in the last years. The purity has increased, which often is causing health problems, to be sure. You don't know what's in them because it's not legal. But
in answer to his question, you are basically saying it's immoral to be taking.
No, I'm not saying it's immoral. No, I'm saying
you're saying you're contributing.
I'm saying that
a bloody industry of death.
The drug trade is often ugly and bloody, but the answer is not simply to give up on that and say, well, therefore, either potentially, don't. I'm not. I guess I.
I know you don't want to moralise. I'm trying to answer his question.
Yes,
should you do it or not?
Well, I'm not judgmental of people who use cocaine, no. And I think it should be legal anyway, and you shouldn't be arrested for it. But I think the people who do it, I would love them to join an ethical cocaine club and be involved in that movement, because it's a growing movement now.
Good. Ewan.
Excuse me. Thank you very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm the former UK Customs Service intelligence analyst for transnational crime. One of my colleagues, Tim Manhire, appeared under his own name in Frederick Forsyth's book about Guinea-Bissau and the cocaine trade. My question follows on from a point you made towards the end about how the US is obviously still the dominant driver on world drugs policy, but not to the extent it used to be. And you got the arrival of Iran, China, Russia, some very interesting stories there. Where do you see the UK and particularly the European countries, because they are, of course, astride the routes for many of them, both heroin and, as you rightly mentioned, cocaine, which is now a major market comparable to the US, because I don't see really that they are, whether people agree with your argument or not, I don't think they're giving it a proper look. And I hope when you have time, because you'll probably be very busy on the follow-up to the book, you say you've worked in Nigeria. I hope you get the chance to follow up on some other issues, on the kind of things that Mr. Gatehouse covered a few years ago from sub-Saharan Africa, because some of them were way ahead of their time, and they're still around.
So I think the question is, can other countries shape global drug policy in the sort of slight retreat of the US, if you like?
I think it's inevitable.
European countries.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable the UK will legalise cannabis. That's going to be the first step. It's not going to happen next week, obviously, but I think it's very conceivable in the next 5 or 10 years. I have no deep insight into when it's going to happen, but there's growing. There's not yet a massive global or countrywide movement. There are many people advocating legalising cannabis, to be sure. But you haven't got tens and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people marching down the street saying legalise cannabis. You haven't got that yet. Nor do you have it in the US for that matter. But actually, the public opinion in the US and the UK towards cannabis has radically shifted in 10 years. Whereas 10 years ago, most opinion polls put the majority of people opposed to legalisation. Now in the US, pretty much across Democrat and Republican, and the same here in the UK, support, so the studies and polls say, legalising cannabis and regulating it. I think there is obviously a big role for the Conservative government in that if they choose to go down that path. I worry how they would approach it because they're likely to go the big cannabis route. But that's also why the Labor Party, now it's in opposition and will be there for at least 5 years, has a unique opportunity. And I would say it's a few things briefly just to finish that. One thing I think it's already happening, which is not necessarily coming from the top, from Downing Street, is more and more police officers and officials around the country have decriminalised drug possession anyway, of sorts. I spoke to some of them for the book.
Well, there's one quote in here at the top of your Britain chapter, a quote from a former British undercover policeman. It says, "They, Washington, are making the rules, and we, Britain, are the children doing as we're told. For a country which has spent hundreds of years developing an empire, we should have realised that we'd be sleepwalking into moral imperialism. The collective and political judgment, which is our drug policy, is not British at all. It's a successful invasion by American thoughts and ideals. That special relationship is not equal."
Well, and as an Australian, I'd say that you could say exactly the same thing about there. Australia has a bit of a different picture, which I won't go into now. But yes, Britain is obviously not the same as the US. There's not the huge, as many people behind bars, although Britain's got far too many people, in my view, behind bars for relatively minor drug offences. But I do think that the UK, the first step is likely, as I said, to be a legalising of cannabis. I think that will happen, again, not next week, but soon. I do think, like it's happening in the US, growing moves to legalise or at least regulate the use of psychedelic drugs for mental health. That's already happening unofficially anyway. I do think there is a room for a serious political party to, yes, legalise and regulate all drugs as a policy. Both before the last election, some members of the Conservative Party and some in Labor called for a Royal Commission into what that would look like. I'm not convinced that's necessary, but a Royal Commission would, in theory at least in the UK, show how a different path would move forward, to not keep drugs as...
But the suggestion from that quote is that where the US goes, we follow.
Well, the US will legalise cannabis federally at some point. Whether it happens with a Democrat president or potentially a Republican, I don't know, but they will do that. I think that is... the fear when Trump came in was that he would try to undo what Obama had allowed in various states to legalise cannabis. And Trump has not done that, despite...
Because it's good business.
It's good business, yeah, and a lot of Republicans are involved in the cannabis business.
You, sir, with the floral shirt, wanted to ask a question.
Hi, Anthony, good job with the book. Thank you for the name, the name drop. I am Danny Kushlik. I spent 25 years campaigning for an end to the drug war, which I now don't do anymore. Thank God. Jesus. I thought we'd be further along than we are. But there are a couple of things that I just wanted to ask, and it's as much a question of people in the room. I think that there were two major frustrations for me. One was, despite some notable differences, that the majority of the media basically either towed the drug war line, or didn't say anything and never challenged politicians, with some notable exceptions, including Tom Newton-Dunn at the Sun, Ian Birrell, and David Seymour, when he was political editor at the Mirror, did some remarkable work, and there are others. But the majority of people don't, and I think it's partly because there's a feedback loop, because politicians don't want to talk about it, so political editors don't challenge them on it, and it's just, you know, there just is no discussion. And so one of my questions is, how do you break that? The other one is the lack of engagement from both the major parties, which was just, it just meant that nothing could really happen, despite the fact that the Green Party shifted, the Liberal Democrats moved on this. And effectively what happens, given that we have a two-party system, is that we keep voting for it. Because unless you oppose it, it carries on. So that we continue to back the drug war at every single general election. So 2 questions. One is, what can the media do, and what can we do to shift those stasis?
It's interesting. I mean, there's no simple answer to either of those, as you would know, having done this issue for decades. But despite the fact that I think a lot of the media is hopeless on this, public opinion has changed a lot, especially on cannabis. Like, I don't think the majority of people would not support legalising heroin. I'm aware of that. But they do support legalising cannabis, which they did not do 10 years ago, including in the UK, the US, Australia and elsewhere. Now, I know the government hasn't done that here yet, I know that. I mean, to me, I think there is space now that Labor was so crushed at the last election. There's space now as an opposition party, when they find a new leader and decide whoever that is, to make this, and this obviously requires pressure from the party and members to do this, to make this an issue that they can call their own. Now, what does that look like? As I said, it's not going to be legalising all drugs, I accept that, but I do think it can be the idea of a policy where no one can be prosecuted for personal possession of any drug or all drugs. Legalising cannabis, to me, is a no-brainer in a regulated way. I think not following the mistakes of the US model. I think the US model is not personally how I would want to legalise cannabis. I think it's problematic and I support it being legalised, but I think it's kind of following a very big cannabis kind of model. I think that's a problem. I think also, like on some issues, I think a lot of journalists who do day-to-day work see it as the story just doesn't change. It's the same old issue. The politicians say the same thing. They're too scared to say anything. I think that is shifting. I mean, there needs to be pressure, though, to me, on journalists as well. I mean, even a so-called liberal paper like The Guardian, editorially, for reasons I don't fully understand, maybe someone can inform me, is actually pretty weak on this issue. Editorially, they have not said much about it.
The 3 journalists that you mentioned all write for the tabloids, whose editorial stance would come down like a ton of bricks on any politician who proposed a blanket legalisation. And yet it's quite influential journalists in those same papers that are...
It is, and yet there has been undeniably in the last years, even in The Sun, a shift in an acknowledgement that the current system doesn't work. Now, there's obviously a big step between that and saying let's legalise all drugs, of course. But I think some politicians who are brave would find in some parts of the media more openness than maybe they fear. A lot of politicians I spoke to remain petrified still of tabloid press coming down on them, and I heard that in Australia as well. In Australia it's the Murdoch press, mainly here it'd be the Daily Mail and others. Although I think it's also... Pardon?
And the Murdoch press.
And the Murdoch press, for sure. But having said that, a few years ago, the Murdoch press editorialised of a real radical change in drug policy, which was had gone much further than The Guardian ever has. Now, like any newspaper or publication, it's very uneven, and I'm not defending one paper over another. I'm saying that it's a mixed picture. I think there is a real opportunity to put major pressure on the Labor Party and opposition to actually get a serious drug reform policy. They have not had one for years. Even Jeremy Corbyn was actually pretty weak on this issue. Wasn't a major focus of his leadership, fine. But there are certain people in the Labor Party who are still there, didn't lose their seats last election, who do actually support the idea of a much more mature policy. They need to be pressured to keep up the pressure on that. And I think the media also needs to be challenged on it too.
You're right in saying that I think one of the big problems in terms of the news media is that the feeling that the story doesn't change.
Yeah.
It's news, so no one wants to cover it. Yes, gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to start by thanking you, Antony. A couple of years ago, I was working in Sydney at the injecting centre there, and we've never had a journalist inside that building to talk to the clients before Antony. Antony was the first one. Everyone was shitting themselves. On the media team, we knew it would be okay because we knew to do it in a really passionate way, and that's exactly what the microphone's cutting out there. But I think it's quite a small chapter in your book, but the clients that you spoke to and featured read that since and
Yes.
empowered by. Yeah, okay, sorry. User error on the microphone. Felt really empowered by the way that you told their story. No, journalists aren't heroes, but and I'm not. But there was a real gratitude for how sensitive you were in telling that. But what I wondered was everywhere that you went in doing the book and all of the insight that you got around the world. There's very little, I guess, out there. Portugal, we know, have decriminalised. There's sort of de facto decriminalisation of all drugs, in other places, but there's very little around full legalisation and regularisation of drugs other than cannabis, and even then only places like Uruguay and certain states of America. Did you glean any kind of ways not to do it? Any pitfalls if any country would take the leap and legalise heroin, cocaine, Class A drugs, things like that? And what would you say is the gold standard kind of model for regulation?
I first want to say thank you for your comments, and I am actually in touch still. In fact, I was messaging him just yesterday, some of the people who were using this safe injecting facility. Just very briefly, the Sydney safe injecting facility was the first in the Southern Hemisphere. There's now one in Melbourne, which was the second. It's operated in Sydney for roughly 20 years. It's been unbelievably successful. Not one person's ever died in the facility. In fact, in every safe injecting facility in the world, no one has ever died anywhere. It's evidence, if nothing else, that they should exist all over the UK and Scotland at a time where this country in Scotland is suffering so much from overdoses. I'd say no country has done it perfectly in a way. I don't see any country moving towards legalising all drugs. I do think that there are certain Central, Latin American and South American countries that are now flirting, at least talking more openly, some, about the possibility of some kind of major reform around cocaine. In March this year, next month, the first time ever a major Colombian politician will put forward legislation which will fail, but it'll put it forward to legalise cocaine. It won't work. In other words, it won't succeed. Colombia obviously has a much more pro-US government now, so it's a mixed picture. I guess I say that because I do think it will need and require a country like that, or somewhere in that area, to do, like I don't see Britain legalising cocaine. I just don't see it happening. Britain is a follower, not a leader. And Australia is the same towards the US. But I do think that there are growing numbers of, sadly, mostly former South American, Latin American leaders saying we need to legalise or at least decriminalise all drugs, including cocaine. A country will do it. Don't ask me which one.
But presumably in a country like Colombia, there are far too many vested interests in keeping
a massive challenge.
The trade illegal.
For sure. And that's why when I discussed before the issue of ethically sourced drugs, clearly there are many forces in, say, Colombia that would be very happy to maintain the status quo because they're doing very well. But there are growing groups, from farmers to advocates to scientists and others, who are saying in a place like Colombia, which has the highest production of cocaine in the world, it provides roughly 70% of the world's cocaine, and it's soaring because demand is so high, that Colombia on one level, which again, because very pro-US, probably will not be the one that does it in the coming year or so, it does make sense for a country like that to do it, or a country like that to do it. And the model, you asked us finally what a model looks like. A model actually brings all players to the table. It actually says that in a place like Colombia, the ones who are suffering the most are the farmers, particularly, the ones who are often being killed. Since the peace deal in 2016, between the FARC and the government, there's been a huge increase in murders of indigenous groups and others who are either trying to move away from the drug or one who are still doing so. And to me, there needs to be a much greater acknowledgement and discussion about that in places like here and elsewhere that's consuming the drug so much, not to be moral about it, but to say this can be different. It doesn't have to be like this. Not to encourage people to use more cocaine. I'm not saying that. I think if people want to take cocaine, they should, and that's great for them.
You're very, very careful not to.
Well, I'm
not
careful
to come
about that
up with
because
any judgment on
because I think the judgmental part misses the point. Because I think when you have people like the head of the Met come out last year and Sadiq Khan, the mayor, say that it completely ignores the point. They said basically that if you use cocaine in London, you are contributing to a dirty supply chain. I'm paraphrasing. And on one level, that's true, but it sort of misses the point. And then what? And so what? So therefore, is the argument don't use cocaine? Sure,
well,
you could
that's
argue.
an argument, right?
Yeah, the argument is it's basically just say no. It's a version of just say no,
But if you're
which doesn't work, as we're seeing by the evidence here.
If your thesis is demand has soared, this is fueling this, and it has terrible consequences because of a kind of militarized war on terror, but demand is the real driver.
It's a big factor.
Then
you legalise it and regulate it.
okay, but if just to put that aside for a second, if you followed Sadiq Khan's advice and just said no, you'd also like.
Well, Nancy Reagan said just say no, and that works out well in America,
No,
didn't
but
it?
I mean,
it's the same message.
I'm just intrigued by your resistance to putting out the message. Just don't do it.
Because I don't think, if I or anyone says that, it literally has zero impact. The evidence is so overwhelming that it has zero impact. And the reason, by the way, so many people now are using cocaine in the UK and elsewhere is complex. Yes, it's got cheaper. Yes, it's more widely available. Yes, apparently you can get it now faster than a pizza in parts of London. It is incredibly easy to access. But the reason why a lot of people are using cocaine, like a lot of drugs, is not simply just to get high. People do that, fine, to have fun on a Friday night. I've got no problem with that. But it's also more complicated than that. In a time where there is massive social dislocation, austerity has caused huge problems in the UK. A lot of people use it as an escape valve, as a lot of drugs, as alcohol. So if one is going to be judgmental about people who use it, like people who judgmentally use, say, opioids, it misses the point. I don't want to be judgmental about people who use drugs for a myriad of reasons. Some people are doing it, don't give a shit about the consequences. Okay, maybe my friends, fine. But a lot of people who use drugs for a range of reasons and a range of different drugs, the point is not to demonize the user, which has never worked, and in many cases in the last 30, 40 years has actually caused more problems than anything else. You actually talk about how it could be different. And you do care.
I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. And I do think you think more often about the people at all ends of the spectrum, which too often a lot of people don't. And frankly, neither does someone like Sadiq Khan or the head of the Met. They don't think about that either, and they should.
We could ask for a show of hands in the room. Who's taking drugs?
You mean illegal drugs, I guess you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about illegal drugs. There we go. So
the majority.
That's the majority of people in there. That's actually more than I expected in here. Was it more than you expected?
Not in London. No. In this kind of crowd, who knows, there could be one joint 20 years ago, everyone used coke every night. Who knows what,
I grew up in Amsterdam, so
Okay, yeah. It's an incredibly common thing. And again, obviously the whole rhetoric of a drug war is either just say no or, in other words, it's taking also the moral question out of the picture of saying that you're morally bad if you take cocaine. You're morally, you are a weak person if you are using heroin or you are smoking a joint, for example. That argument has been there for 50 years. And I think it's counterproductive. I think it's wrong. I think it's anti-intellectual, and it's just bad policy that causes too much carnage.
Anyone else? Yes, you with the hat on.
Hello. Thank you for the book and the talk. I don't have some kind of qualifier to go with my question. I'm just a journalism student. But something that's really interested me in your work is your focus on the sort of geopolitical mechanisms that are at play within the war on drugs. And something I was really interested for you to expand upon now was that earlier on you seemed to imply that it was within the interests of larger, more developed nations such as the United States, the so-called sort of consumer drug states, the perpetuation of the drug war within countries like Honduras was actually in their interests in terms of controlling that sort of area, perhaps with some kind of imperialistic mindset, maybe. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit, because I found it vastly interesting that countries bathed in this sort of network of suffering can be used in a sort of control sense.
I talk about that in the book quite a lot, but I'll just briefly that Honduras has been a key staging post for US intervention in that region, not just about drugs, particularly since the Reagan era, so roughly 40 or so years ago, a bit less. And Honduras has been a client state for 100 years of the US. It used to be controlled by big fruit companies. It's now controlled, I guess, by narcos and a narco government. And a reason I say that is, and it's not unique to Honduras, sadly, is many countries that I think the US and other major states are happy to have as client states, because, as I said before, it's much easier to have a compliant leader or a compliant regime than a democracy. A democracy may well decide to kick you out, like Bolivia did years ago with Morales. They kicked out the DEA roughly 10 years ago. And cocaine production dived. There were problems with the system, and I won't go into that, but in other words, this idea somehow that the only way a state can operate is to allow the DEA to operate is not the way, I think, in my view, a mature country, if they have a choice, would operate. And I think if you asked, which America never does, how a lot of Hondurans feel about US influence in their country and US involvement in their country, not just since 2009, since the coup, but I'd say in general for the last 100 years, they would say it has been overwhelmingly negative. Yes, many of them want to flee to the US. Yes, because it's the closest country near them that is safer. But it's, again, not unique to Honduras. If you spend time and speak to a lot of people, I didn't go there, but spoke to a lot of people in other areas, for example, in Mexico and elsewhere. The effect of a US drug war in Mexico, since there was pressure on the Mexican government in 2006 to unleash a drug war, which has been going for years but worsened since then, has been the worst violence that country's ever seen. Last year in 2019, there were roughly 40,000 people killed. Not all because of the drug war, but a lot. And the idea that the US is putting massive pressure and funding and training into the Mexican government, I'm not saying the Mexican government has no say in what they're doing. They do. But the massive amounts of pressure the Mexican government is under from successive administrations, Democrat and Republican, shows that many of these states don't have independent drug policies. They just don't. And I think the effect of that is massive violence and dislocation. I think if you asked, which America never does, what's the drug policy people in Honduras would like, most of them won't say legalise cocaine. They won't say that. In fact, often people's views are quite conservative there, but they don't want US meddling in their country because the evidence is so overwhelming of the effect that it's had on people's lives. And I guess I feel too often when these issues are talked about that the colonial aspect is ignored. That somehow I think too much of journalism in this 21st century doesn't talk about imperialism as something that happened back in the day. It's alive and well now. From Honduras to Palestine to Afghanistan, it is real and it's happening. Not just the US, other countries as well. But it's a major factor in how our world operates. And I think too often the media, especially the mainstream press, doesn't say that. It's not some conspiracy theory. It's obvious that US and other Western states have massive negative influence on places like Honduras and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I think it should be said.
I think it's time for one more question. You at the back.
Hey, apologies, I arrived rather late, so you've probably already said this. I have actually got your book as well, but I haven't reached this sort of chapter. But, medical cannabis in the UK is being trialed. You've probably been talking about this. Surely you're just thinking too radically. Surely it's small steps in a little nation like UK. Surely we've got enough radical politics going on at the moment with Brexit, Labour in disarray at the moment. It's got to get themselves electable again. So you're just throwing yourselves too far forward, aren't you? Surely we wait for the trial results. We wait for the sort of the lobbying that will take place from the NHS, from the medical profession to say this stuff we should be using it a little bit more. And then, slowly, it's a generational thing, perhaps a little bit. Maybe it's going to be, 20 years down the road?
Well, it might be, but I hope for UK's sake it's not. I mean, I say the same about my own country, Australia, which is not about to legalise cannabis either. Let's be clear. Look, generally these things don't happen overnight. That's true. I don't think legalising cannabis is that radical anymore. I mean, Canada is a major Western country that's done it. It's not going perfectly. I won't go into the details, but it's going relatively well. The sky hasn't fallen in. Many US states have legalised cannabis. Again, it's not perfect, but it's going relatively well. The black market's still too massive there. There's problems with it, to be sure. I think medical cannabis clearly is something that I support and should be encouraged, but I think the idea of allowing and legalising and regulating cannabis for any purpose is a first logical step. I don't think it's radical. Even 10 years ago, I think it would have been seen as radical. It's not anymore, when major countries are now doing so, and more countries are planning to do so. I don't know which country is the next one to drop, so to speak, and legalise. Which one? Right, okay. Right, okay. And there'll be others. And I think you will find various other... Again, no one's saying, including me, that suddenly one day the world, whatever that means, will suddenly legalise drugs. We can't agree on anything about anything in terms of climate change or whatever. So I'm not suggesting that for a second. So there'll be a country will make a decision for their own purposes. And let's not forget, countries that initially wanted to legalise cannabis breach UN conventions. And that's something that is a constant negotiation between those countries and the UN. The US years ago was incredibly pissed off when Uruguay legalised, but had it been someone other than Obama, I suspect they would have been pressured a lot. And Obama generally on that issue turned a blind eye, didn't put massive pressure. Had it happened during, say, George W. Bush or maybe even Trump, it may have been different. So for all the faults that Obama had, and there were so many, I think his drug policy domestically and globally at least was a small taste of how a US policy could be different. And I'm not optimistic, but I do think there would be real changes if some of the Democratic candidates would win, especially on cannabis and other drugs. At least there's an acknowledgement that the drug war is a disaster. That sounds like an obvious thing to say maybe in this room, but you have a Trump administration that's been massively increasing and expanding it. So to have someone who challenges that, questions it, openly talks, as Sanders does and Warren, about reparations for the negative effects of a drug war, they might not win, of course, but it's still a profound shift from 4 years ago when no Democratic candidate talked about legalising cannabis at the federal level. Hillary didn't. And here we are. Well, I was saying before 5 to 10, and that's sort of just, I'd like to think it would happen next week, but that's probably a bit too soon. I think 5 to 10 is realistic. People I speak to who live here and know more about the UK than I do say that's not unrealistic. Someone here can shout out that's bullshit. I think that's possible. And again, you might presume that would not happen with a Conservative government. It could. There are certainly people around Johnson who do advocate for it. There's some, of course, who oppose it too. Their reasons might be different to mine to legalise it, because they want to make money through the cannabis industry or whatever, okay. But it's not impossible at all. And I think you will find more and more cases, as you do see in the UK and Australia, of people who even can't access medical cannabis. It's allowed to exist here, and there are still countless people, as there are in my country, where medical cannabis is legal and parents can't access it for their kids. They have to go overseas to get it still, or various other cases. This is inhumane and crazy. I think public pressure along those kind of lines will increase, whether it's a Tory government or Labour.
I think, unless there's any more burning questions, I will bring it to a close there. Antony Loewenstein, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah. Thank you.